Hi everyone! For this anatomical model review video, I will go over some of the bones and bone markings of the skull. These are the ones our students have to know. I will point with this little wire instead of a metal pointers because these are actual real bones from real people and they can be very fragile, so we have to be extra careful with it. So let's start with bones. So this right here is the frontal bone. This right here is the temporal bone, and how it's easy to remember is just remember temple, something with music, which is with the ears. So this is kind of close to where the ears are. And then you have parietal bone right here, parietal bone. And then in the back of the skull, you have the occipital bone on the bottom. If you were to, I was to lift up the skull, you will see where the tape area is, then that is the occipital bone. Then you have the ethmoid bone, which can be seen from the front part of the skull right there, where my red wire is pointing at. That is the ethmoid bone. Sphenoid bone is what kind of makes up part of your eye sockets. So either this one right there, okay, this one, or this one on the other side. Remember, is not the slit, not the space, but the actual bone surface here and the bone surface there, not the slit. We'll get to that in a bit. And then for zygomatic bone is the cheekbones right here. So that's the cheekbones here, or here is what we call the zygomatic bone. And then we have the maxilla. Maxilla forms part of your nose and the upper jaw, okay? So there's this portion right here is the maxilla bone. Then you have mandible bone, which is then your entire lower jaw right here, or from the side view, this is part of your mandible bone. Then you have lacrimal bone. Lacrimal bone, easy to remember. Lacrimal sounds like tears, you know. So you can remember it. This is where tears are, close to your nose. This is your nose bridge. So these two little bones right next to the nasal bone on either side, or you can say they're lateral to your nasal bone, is then the lacrimal bone right here and the little lacrimal bone right there. Okay, again, let me use the little wire. Lacrimal bone right there and lacrimal bone right there. This one is the nasal bone, which is what forms your nose bridge at the top. So that is all for the bones. And now for bone marking that we can see from this view is right here at the bottom, this little pointy part, and you can actually feel it in back of your ears, a hard little area. We call this the mastoid process. Mastoid process. And then you have the hole right there where your ear canal goes into. That is called the external auditory meatus, or also called external acoustic meatus. Meatus usually means a hole or opening of some sort or channel, and it is for auditory, so that's why it's the ear hole. And then from the nose, in the anterior view of the skull, you look inside the nose, and this little flap right there inside the nose is what we call the inferior nasal concha. Inferior nasal concha on this side, or inferior nasal concha on that side, okay? And then we have the superior orbital fissure, which is this slit right there. Fissure always means a slit of some sort, not a hole or a channel, but a slit. So superior means the top one that you can see right there, superior orbital fissure here, or superior orbital fissure right there. The bottom one, this one down here, this slit at the bottom is called the inferior orbital fissure. Inferior orbital fissure, and right there also inferior orbital fissure. So again, don't confuse it with the sphenoid bone. These are the actual fissure, either superior or inferior, and is around the eyes, so that's why it's orbital, okay? All right, now let's use another skull for the inside parts of the skull. So here we are at the inside parts of the skull, and remember that on this skull, maxilla was right there on the upper jaw, forming your upper jaw and also these bone areas around your nose. Now, if you look at the bottom of the skull, okay, seeing the front, this is, remember that maxilla we said that forms the upper jaw? So if you flip it upside down, this part of the jaw on top, the roof of your mouth, in the interior side is still the maxilla bone, okay? So this, if I point there, is still considered as the maxilla bone. What's back here in the roof of your mouth, posterior parts of the roof of your mouth, is what we call the palatine bone. So maxilla bone and palatine bone. Now onto bone marking, which are either protrusion, depression, or holes. We'll start with the jugular foramen. Jugular foramen, if you look closely at the skull, there's a big giant hole, okay? So on either side of the big giant hole, the very first hole right there is the jugular foramen. Foramen means it's a hole of some sort for blood vessels to go through. In this case, your jugular vein, either that one or on this side right above that big giant hole, okay? So right there. So jugular foramen, jugular foramen. And right above that, you see this circular hole. That is the carotid canal for where carotid arteries go through, either this one or this one. They're both carotid canal, and it will go straight into inside of the brain for supplying the brain with blood. And then you have the giant hole right there, which is called the foramen magnum, which is where your spinal cord actually comes out of your brain towards your spine. Okay, so the foramen being a hole, magnum being giant. So literally a giant hole is what it is. Foramen magnum right there. Okay, or if you flip this skull upside down, you can also see the foramen magnum right there as well. Okay, and then the last part on this view of the skull, you have these two protrusion right there. That is called the occipital condyle. This occipital condyle. Condyle means some sort of protrusion and curvature that will form a joint with another bone. And I'll talk about that when we get to the joints, but this is the a condyle that forms a joint with the atlas bone, which is the very first cervical vertebrae. Now on the inside, you have this little front portion of the skull, and there's this little pointy part of the skull, very pointy and sharp kind of. This sticking up part into the skull on the interior view of the skull is then the crista galli, okay? Crista galli for the pointy part. And what about these holes on either side of it, sort of lateral to the crista galli? Then is your cribriform plate here or cribriform plate there, okay? So again, right there more clearly, this little indentation with hole looking things and this little indentation with hole looking things, okay? For the cribriform plate, that's where your olfactory neurons actually dangle into your nasal cavity. And then you have your sella turcica, which is this little depression right here. It's sort of like, shapes like a little curvature, kind of like a seat for your pituitary gland. It's exactly where the pituitary gland kind of dangles from your brain and rests on top of this little curvature area called the sella turcica as a bone marking. And then you have optic canal. Optic canal is these holes right here, this one or this one, and it goes straight out into the eye socket if you were to poke all the way through, so you know that it goes into the eyes. Okay, so we poke it through there and you'll see it comes right out the eye sockets, okay, the orbital area. So that's why that is the optic nerve coming in from one of your eyes, and the other optic nerve comes in from the other eye. They will form a little optic chiasm that crosses over. We'll talk about that when we get to the nervous system, and comes back towards your occipital lobe of the brain, which is why this bone was called the occipital bone in the back of the skull. We will end the skull with four connection that connects the big bones of the skull together. So if you look closely, you will see that there is a connection between the frontal bone and the parietal bone in these little zigzag lines that you're seeing, and what we call this sutures. And there's four different sutures on the skull. The first one right here is called the coronal suture. Coronal suture that again connects the frontal bone with the parietal bones. And then you have one on the side that connect the temporal bone with the parietal bone, which is this little suture right here called the squamous suture. And if you look on the back, you will be able to see the middle one. Remember that when you cut down the middle of the, any anatomical parts, we call that the sagittal parts. So hence this one is called the sagittal suture. And this one you can really see what I mean by these zigzag or jigsaw-like bones that are coming together to form this joint called the suture. And the specific one again is the sagittal suture. And then you have over here where you have this connection between the occipital bone and the parietal bone. That is the lambdoid suture down here. Lambdoid suture. And that's the 4 sutures of the skull. And that's it.